What my son-in-law didn't know, what none of them knew, was at the hospital where he practiced medicine, the one he'd spent 15 years climbing the ladder in, the one he bragged about at every family dinner, like he'd built it with his own two hands, was part of a network I'd quietly acquired over the course of a decade. He thought I was just a retired electrician from Scranton. He wasn't entirely wrong. I did start as an electrician. I worked with my hands for 22 years, but somewhere along the way, I also learned how to read a balance sheet, how to spot undervalued infrastructure, and how to be very, very patient. My daughter called me on a Thursday evening in October. I remember because I was in the middle of rewiring an old lamp my late wife had loved. I still fix things even when I don't have to. It keeps me honest. And when I heard my daughter's voice, I knew something was wrong before she said a single word. "Dad," she said, "can you come for dinner Sunday? Wendell wants to talk to you." Wendell. That's my son-in-law. Married my daughter 9 years ago in a small ceremony in upstate New York. I paid for that wedding. Didn't make a fuss about it. She was happy, and that was enough for me. I said sure, I'd be there. I asked if everything was okay. She said yes, just something Wendell wanted to discuss. Her voice had that tight quality it gets when she's trying not to worry me. I spent 3 days not sleeping well. Let me back up a little, because you need to understand who Wendell is before you understand what happened. Wendell grew up in Connecticut. His father was a thoracic surgeon. His mother taught at Yale. He went to Dartmouth, then Johns Hopkins for his MD. By any measure, the man is accomplished. And he knows it. He has always known it in that particular way, that people who've never faced real hardship tend to know things, loudly, casually, like it's just the natural order. When he first started dating my daughter, he was respectful enough to me, polite in that distant way. He shook my hand too firmly and asked about my trade with the same tone you'd use asking about a hobby. My daughter told me later that he'd once referred to me to a colleague as blue-collar, not cruelly, she said, just descriptively, like it explained something. I let it go. You pick your battles when you're 63 years old. Over the years, though, the politeness wore thin at the edges. He made jokes at dinners that landed just wrong enough to sting. Once, when I mentioned I'd been looking at some commercial properties down in Philadelphia, he laughed and said something about how real estate was a great hobby for retirees. My daughter shot him a look. I just nodded and passed the bread. My granddaughter, their daughter, 8 years old now, and the smartest person in any room she enters, she calls me Pop, and she sits next to me at every family dinner and tells me about whatever she's been reading that week. And those are the best 40 minutes of my month. The rest of it, I manage. Sunday came. I drove up to their house in Westchester, the big colonial they bought 5 years ago. Nice place. I always notice that the gutters need cleaning every time I visit, but I've learned not to say anything. My daughter made pot roast. She does it when she's anxious. Cooks the things she learned from her mother, like muscle memory for worry. I ate 2 helpings and told her it was perfect and meant it. After dinner, my granddaughter was sent upstairs to read, and Wendell poured himself a glass of bourbon and sat down across from me at the dining room table like we were about to negotiate a contract. He started slowly. Said he and my daughter had been talking, said they were thinking about the future, about financial security, about making sure my granddaughter had every opportunity available to her. I listened. Then he said they were considering a private school for my granddaughter, a very good one. Very exclusive, tuition around $42,000 a year. He said he thought it would be appropriate for me to contribute. Significantly contribute was the phrase he used. I asked how much he had in mind. He said $100,000, a one-time contribution, up front, to cover the first few years and help with other associated costs. He said it in a tone that suggested this was not an unreasonable request, that in fact he was being quite generous in framing it as a contribution rather than an expectation. I looked at my daughter. She was looking at her plate. I said, "That's a lot of money for a retired electrician." And Wendell said, and I want to be precise here because I've turned this sentence over in my mind many times since. He said, "Well, that's exactly why we're asking now while you still have access to your savings. We want to make sure Cecily's future is secured before, and then he stopped himself, but not quite fast enough. Before I get too old, he meant. Before I spend it down. Before I spend it down. Before it disappears somewhere he can't plan around. My daughter looked up then. She saw my face. I don't know what she saw exactly, but she said quietly, "Wendell." He said, "I'm just being practical, Miriam." Miriam, that's my daughter's name. My wife picked it, and I have never once in 63 years heard it said by someone and not felt something move in my chest. I excused myself and went to the bathroom. I ran cold water over my wrists the way I used to after long days in the summer heat, and I looked in the mirror for a moment, and then I dried my hands on the good hand towel my daughter keeps out for guests, and I went back to the table. I told Wendell I'd think about it. He nodded like that was the reasonable outcome. I drove home that night, and I did think about it. I thought about it very carefully. What I haven't told you yet, what I haven't told almost anyone, truthfully, is that 20 years ago, when the hospital system in our region was struggling and nobody wanted to touch distressed medical infrastructure, I started quietly buying in. Not the hospitals themselves at first, the property, the buildings, parking structures, adjacent parcels, then stakes in the management entities, then, over time, larger pieces of the operational network. I have a business partner named Otis who handles the day-to-day. He's a finance man, went to Wharton, has an office in Midtown Manhattan that looks like something out of a magazine. Otis and I met on a job site 30 years ago when I was doing electrical work on a building he was renovating, and we've been doing business together ever since. He thinks it's funny that I still fix old lamps. The hospital network. Briarwood Health Partners, which is what we called the entity, now includes 4 hospitals in the Tri-State area. Wendell's Hospital, Aldermore Regional, is one of them. Has been for 6 years. Wendell, as I said, is a physician. A very good one by reputation. He runs the cardiac unit at Aldermore. He does not sit on any administrative or financial committees. He has never had occasion to look closely at who owns the building where he practices medicine. His name is Wendell Hargrove III. The network's parent entity is called Hargrove Capital Partners. Different Hargrove, obviously. Just the name I'd chosen years earlier for a holding company, back when I was still romanticizing the idea of legacy a little. I've since stopped romanticizing things. My son-in-law had spent 6 years practicing in a building I co-owned and had never once noticed. I didn't do anything dramatic immediately. That's not how I operate. I spent 2 weeks after that Sunday dinner doing nothing different than usual. I had breakfast, I read, I drove down to visit Otis twice, I called my daughter 3 times. She seemed tense. Wendell, she told me, was optimistic about my response. I told her to give me a little more time. On the 3rd week, I had Otis pull the employment and contract structures at Aldermore. Standard review. We do it quarterly anyway. What I found was that Wendell's contract for the cardiac unit directorship, a very lucrative administrative role on top of his clinical work, was up for renewal in 60 days. The renewal was largely a formality. These things usually are. The board signs off, the compensation package updates, everybody moves on. Except that our entity, as majority stakeholder, has 2 seats on the board. And Otis was about to send a routine letter to schedule the renewal meeting. I asked Otis to hold the letter, not cancel anything, not take any action, just hold. Then I called my daughter and asked if she and Wendell would like to come to dinner at my place. I told her I'd made a decision about the school contribution and I wanted to discuss it in person. She sounded relieved. She said Wendell would be pleased. I made chicken piccata that Friday night. My wife's recipe, the one that calls for more lemon than seems reasonable and always comes out right anyway. I set the table properly, the good plates, cloth napkins, the whole thing. My granddaughter wasn't with them. They'd left her with a sitter, and I was sorry about that, but it was probably for the best. Wendell came in looking comfortable, settled, like a man who believes the meeting is already over and he's just showing up for the paperwork. We ate. I asked about the hospital. He talked for a while about a procedure he'd done that week, something complex and impressive that I listened to with genuine interest. Whatever else is true about Wendell, he is a skilled doctor. I've never questioned that. After dinner, I poured coffee. I told them I had something I wanted to say. My daughter folded her hands on the table. Wendell leaned back in his chair with his arm hooked over the back of it, casual, already composing his gracious acceptance. I said, "Wendell, I've been thinking about the conversation we had a few weeks ago." He nodded, magnanimous. I said, "You asked me for $100,000. You framed it as a contribution to Cecily's education, which I appreciate, but what I heard underneath that was something a little different. I heard a man who has spent 9 years looking at me and seeing a limitation his wife came with." The arm came down off the back of the chair. I kept going because I had practiced this part. I started working at 16. I pulled wire in buildings so cold in the winter that my fingers stopped bending right. I saved for 30 years while raising Miriam alone after her mother died, and somewhere in there, I also learned how to build things that last. I paused. Not everyone gets to see that part. Wendell said with some careful edge in his voice, "I'm not sure what you're implying." I said I wasn't implying anything. I said I was going to tell him something directly, and I hoped he'd hear it the way it was meant. I slid a single piece of paper across the table. It was the organizational chart for Briarwood Health Partners. Clean, official, our two names, mine and Otis's, at the top. I said, "Aldermore Regional is part of this network. Has been since you've worked there. Your contract renewal is in 58 days. Otis was about to send the scheduling letter this week." I asked him to hold it. Wendell looked at the paper for a long time. My daughter looked at the paper for a long time. My daughter looked at Wendell. I said, "I want to be very clear that I am not threatening you. Your clinical work will not be affected. Your position as a physician is not in question. But the administrative directorship, and the compensation that comes with it, that's a different conversation." The room was quiet enough that I could hear the refrigerator hum from the kitchen. "I'm not a retired electrician with savings that are running down," I said. "I am a 63-year-old man who built something, quietly, because that's how I was raised. I never told you because it wasn't your business. It still isn't, really, but you made it my business when you sat down across from my daughter and told me to pay up." Wendell put down the paper. He opened his mouth. He closed it. "I am not going to give you $100,000, I said. "I am going to set up a dedicated education trust for my granddaughter, funded at my discretion, because she is my granddaughter, and I would do anything for that little girl. That has nothing to do with you." I stood up and picked up the coffee cups. "The contract renewal letter will go out Monday," I said. "Everything proceeds normally. I just wanted us to have an honest conversation first. Something I think we should have had a long time ago." I don't know exactly what was said between them on the drive home that night. My daughter called me the next morning, early, before I'd finished my first cup of coffee. She didn't say much at first. Then she said, "Dad, why didn't you ever tell me?" I said, "Because you never asked what I did. You asked how I was doing," which is a better question, honestly. She was quiet a while. Then she laughed a little. A short, strange sound, half surprised. "Wendell couldn't sleep," she said. I said, "I imagine not." She said, "He wants to apologize to you." I told her that was his choice to make. I wasn't requiring anything from him. I just needed him to know who he'd been talking to all these years. She said, "I think I needed to know too." That one stayed with me. I've thought about it since. The way children don't always see their parents whole. They see the version that raised them, which is real, which is true. But they miss the other chapters. My daughter knew me as the father who packed her lunches and helped with algebra and sat in the dark for a year after her mother died and slowly climbed back out of it. She didn't know the part where I'd spent winter nights reading financial statements at the kitchen table after she went to bed, learning a language I hadn't grown up speaking, building something from nothing on pure stubbornness. Maybe that's on me, for not telling the story. Cecily, my granddaughter, started at a new school this past September. Not the exclusive one Wendell had picked. A different one, a wonderful one. A school with a greenhouse on the roof and a drama program that does Chekhov adaptations with 8-year-olds, which I find genuinely delightful. I funded the trust at the beginning of the year. No ceremony, no announcement. I just called the attorney, and it was done. Wendell sent me a letter. Handwritten, 3 pages, which I respected. He said things I think he meant. I wrote back 2 paragraphs, which I also meant. We are not friends. We may never be friends, but he's the father of my granddaughter, and he is a good doctor. And I believe he is trying to understand something about himself that is uncomfortable to look at. I can give him time for that. My daughter and I have dinner every other week now, just the 2 of us, on nights when Wendell is on call. We talk differently than we used to. She asks about the business. She asks what I was like when I was her age. She asked me once if I was lonely, living alone in the house she grew up in. I said not usually. I said I have enough to keep me busy. What I didn't say, because I'm still not great at this, is that those dinners with her are the thing I look forward to most. That the rest of it, the properties, the meetings, the balance sheets, that's just what I made with my hands when my hands needed something to do. That the actual point of all of it was always just her. Just her. And that little girl who calls me Pop and tells me about what she's reading. Everything else is just wiring.